The laughter of children filled the air around Cedar Creek, their faces bright with the joy of a perfect summer day. But then the sound changed, a single, sharp gasp, as the first pebble thrown into the river didn't sink, but gently bounced upwards. It was in that impossible, silent ascent of a simple stone that we knew the worst thing had happened, not to the river, but to the very fabric of our world. I never met Dr. Aris Thorne, not really. Our interactions were mediated through a chain of increasingly frantic emails, then whispered phone calls, and finally, those scratchy audio logs that Professor Reed, Aris's former advisor, passed along years later. Reed, who always had a knack for collecting stray, inconvenient truths, referred to them as the Thorne tapes, though they were just digital files, compressed and recompressed, stripped of anything extraneous until only the conviction and the weariness remained. Aris, Reed told me, had found something out in the Cedar Creek Hollow, something that defied every single one of the neat, violet-inked equations that lined the walls of the physics department at the university. The hollow itself wasn't much to look at, or so the local newspaper clip, faded acid lime on cheap newsprint, claimed. A forgotten stretch of land where the old logging roads dissolved into thickets of aggressive ferns and pines that grew too close together, their needles forming a dense, perpetually damp canopy. The creek itself, Cedar Creek, was supposed to be unremarkable. A tributary of a larger river, known only for its stubborn refusal to completely freeze even in the harshest winters. But Alara Vance, the woman who lived furthest up the hollow, past the last abandoned hunting cabin, had been saying for 60 years that the creek had a mind of its own. Aris had arrived in the hollow with a portable gravimeter, a magnetotelluric sensor, and a stack of topographical maps that were already out of date. Reed had secured a small, dilapidated ranger station for her to use as a base, a place with peeling acid lime paint on the window frames and a single, unreliable generator. The first few weeks, I gathered from the logs, were all about calibration. Aris, methodical to a fault, established a grid, set up her equipment. She was looking for a specific kind of seismic activity, Reed said, something subtle. Not a tremor, but a sustained, almost imperceptible hum that might indicate unusual geological stress. What she found was, well, something else entirely. The logs became less formal after that. More personal. The first truly anomalous reading was a gravitational fluctuation, minor at first, a blip, but consistent, always in the same narrow band of the creek. Aris, ever the skeptic, recalibrated, reran diagnostics. It's sensor drift, I recall her saying on one early recording, her voice sharp with self-doubt. Or maybe an atmospheric anomaly, something localized. But the pattern persisted. The creek, in a section no wider than a man's stride, behaved as if gravity was slightly less effective there. Water flowed uphill for a few meters before resuming its downward course. Not dramatically, not a waterfall in reverse, but a slow, contrary current that caused small eddies and a perpetual, unnatural stillness in that segment. Local fishermen, the few who still ventured that deep, called it the loop. They said fish went in and never came out, just circled. I spent 3 days just watching the current with a handful of neon orange biodegradable dye, Aris recounted on one log, the rustle of papers audible, just watching it, fighting against every instinct, every textbook I've ever read, every axiom I hold dear. It's not an optical illusion. It's not an updraft. It's a genuine, measurable, persistent defiance of basic physics. And the only explanation, the only one that fits the data, is. She trailed off, a long, heavy silence. The only explanation is that the explanation doesn't exist. That's when Alara Vance entered the picture. Reed mentioned Alara as a kind of local oracle, the woman who knew everything about the hollow because she had, as the saying went, grown out of its soil. Aris, I think, initially saw her as a source of local color, anecdotal evidence that could provide context but not data. But Alara had kept journals, for over 50 years. Detailed, handwritten logs in a small, cramped script, chronicling the weather, the wildlife, and the peculiarities of the creek. Not just the loop, but the way certain patches of foliage were always a deeper, more vibrant violet than their surroundings, even in winter. How the water sometimes tasted faintly of ozone, or how the birds would avoid that specific stretch of river entirely. What strikes me at this point is how much of what we dismiss as folklore, or eccentricity, is simply data collected outside a recognized framework. We look for patterns we expect to see, or patterns we're trained to measure. We send in specialists with their high-tech gear and dismiss the people who have lived and breathed a phenomenon for generations as being too unscientific to understand what they're seeing. It's not about intelligence, it's about institutional blindness, a willful refusal to believe that truth can wear homespun and speak in metaphors. Aris was, I think, starting to understand this, but the full weight of it, the corrosive part, hadn't quite settled in yet. Aris started overlaying Ilara's observations with her own instrument readings. The correlation was unsettlingly precise. Ilara had noted a particularly violent thunderstorm in 78, followed by an increase in the creek's stubbornness. Aris's seismic data, recovered from historical archives, showed a minor tremor exactly then, originating from the same geological fault line that ran beneath the hollow. Ilara's meticulous records of bird migration patterns, showing a growing avoidance of the loop area over the decades, aligned perfectly with Aris's own measurements of increasing gravitational anomalies. The anomaly wasn't just stable, it was slowly, subtly expanding. She knew, Aris whispered on one tape, her voice thick with something that sounded like awe and resentment. She knew it all. The specific gravimetric fluctuations, the way the local flora adapted, the subtle distortions in the magnetic field that were only detectable with an ultrasensitive magnetometer. She had described it all, in layman's terms, in her beautiful, infuriatingly detailed journals. She described the exact moment the gravitational field shifted in 1978, not by numbers, but by noting that her kettle, sitting on the edge of the creek to cool, tilted like a drunkard, without reason, and the water inside it spun itself sick. That's not quite right. She said it spun itself into a dizzying circle, like a dog chasing its own tail, then poured out, defying the bank. And because she didn't have a PhD, because she didn't have a grant or a fancy lab coat, because she just lived there and observed, no one believed her. Actually, wait. I think I heard that detail about the kettle from Reed, not directly from Aris's tapes. The memory blurs. That's the thing about these stories, isn't it? The further they travel, the more they become, less about the facts, and more about the echoes. The important part is that Aris had found her smoking gun, or, more accurately, her swirling kettle. Ilara Vance was not just a witness, she was a self-trained, lifelong researcher whose methodology, while unorthodox, was undeniably rigorous. The original paragraph I was thinking about earlier, it was about a specific morning in my own life. I remember waking up once, years ago, to the smell of burnt toast, but it wasn't my toast. It was coming from next door, through a wall so thin you could hear arguments about what color to paint the kitchen. And I remember thinking, quite clearly, that the smell of someone else's small, domestic failure was so much more potent, more real, than any grand catastrophe I might read about in the news. It was the intimate, unavoidable proximity of it that made it feel so personal, so immediate. A faint, almost acid lime haze of disappointment, not my own, but still, undeniably there. It's similar to how Aris must have felt, inheriting Ilara's quiet, daily battle with an impossible truth. The personal cost of someone else's unacknowledged reality. Aris prepared her report. She cross-referenced Ilara's journals, included photographs, diagrams, and her own painstakingly collected data. She outlined the implications, a localized, persistent gravitational anomaly, slowly expanding, with potential long-term ecological impacts. She sent it up the chain, to her department head, to the Regional Geological Survey, even a preliminary draft to a national agency dedicated to unclassified phenomena. The responses came back, one by one, each more dismissive than the last. Insufficient data. Anecdotal evidence. Requires further, independent verification. The core wound, I think, started festering then. Aris had gathered more than sufficient data. The independent verification was Ilara Vance's 50 years of observations. And the very nature of the phenomenon made standard protocols almost impossible to apply without acknowledging its fundamental impossibility first. They weren't rejecting her evidence, they were rejecting the premise that such evidence could exist. They kept asking for more, but they meant different. Aris's voice crackled on a tape, a long sigh escaping her. They wanted something that would fit into their existing models, their grant applications, their departmental budget lines. They wanted me to reframe it as a microseismic event, or a localized magnetic field variation, or even a weather phenomenon. Anything but what it was. What it is. They wanted me to lie, politely, scientifically. And what do you do, when the truth you found, the truth that is undeniable, concrete, and measurable, simply doesn't fit into the established structure of what can be true? When the very detail that makes it real, makes it specific, is precisely what renders it incredible to those who hold the power. Have you ever felt that? That specific, acid-lime burn of knowing something absolutely, fundamentally, that others refuse to even consider, not because of a lack of evidence, but a lack of framework. Reed, her mentor, told her to pivot. Publish what you can, Aris, she advised on a call, the audio surprisingly clear, Reed's voice calm, almost soothing. Focus on the ecological impacts. The changes in the plant life, the water chemistry. We can push the gravitational anomaly part later, once you've established a baseline of credibility on the fringes. Reed was a master of strategic justice, playing the long game. She understood that sometimes you had to sell a partial truth to preserve the possibility of a full truth. But Aris couldn't. Not entirely. She tried. She wrote drafts focusing on the plant mutations, the strange, vibrant violet hues of the mosses along the loop, the sudden, inexplicable decline in specific insect populations. She even managed to get one paper accepted, a minor publication in an ecological journal, noting unusual trophic cascade effects in a localized riparian ecosystem. It was, as Reed pointed out, a foot in the door. But it felt like a betrayal. Not of Alara Vance, who understood the compromises, but of the truth itself. The truth was the gravitational anomaly. Everything else was a symptom. And Aris, with her field report spread across the acid-lime painted desk in the ranger station, under the cold, electric violet glow of the single bare bulb, couldn't shake the feeling that she was just contributing to the elegant lie, the palatable half-truth that would allow everyone to keep looking away from the real issue. The climax of this, as Reed described it to me, wasn't a sudden explosion of recognition or a dramatic confrontation. It was quieter. It was a private call with Dr. Eleanor Finch, the head of the national agency Aris had tried to contact. Finch was a legend, a woman who had built her career on meticulously debunking claims of the impossible, but always with respect, always with scientific rigor. Aris had hoped Finch, of all people, would understand. Dr. Thorne, Finch's voice was measured, professional. Your data is, I must admit, compellingly presented. The consistency across your instruments, and the correlation with Ms. Vance's historical observations, it's impressive. Aris, I imagine, felt a flicker of hope then. A genuine validation. However, Finch continued, we cannot, under any circumstances, endorse a finding that violates known laws of physics without a mechanism, a theory, bridge, if you will, to explain how this could possibly be occurring. To do so would undermine the very foundation of scientific inquiry. But the data is the mechanism, Aris countered, her voice tight, straining against the static. The data shows the violation. It's not a theory, it's an observation, repeatedly confirmed. Are we to ignore what is demonstrably real because it doesn't fit our current understanding? Finch was silent for a long moment. Then, very softly, she said, Dr. Thorne, I understand your frustration. Believe me, I do. But my mandate is not to confirm anomalies. It is to explain them. And if they cannot be explained, they cannot be acknowledged by an institution like ours. Not publicly, at least. Not without causing chaos. That was the private confrontation. It confirmed everything Aris had suspected, the data was good, the phenomenon was real, and it didn't matter. Not to the people who could enact change. Not to the institutions. It was an intellectual Pyrrhic victory. She was right, but her rightness was irrelevant in the face of institutional inertia and the fear of chaos. The decision to act became irreversible, not in a grand, public way, but internally. Aris stopped sending out formal reports. She continued her research, but now it was for Elara. She focused on mitigating the localized effects of the anomaly, experimenting with specific plant species that seemed to thrive in the altered gravitational field, finding ways to reroute the parts of the creek most affected. She created a small, self-contained ecological study, a living testament to a truth no one else would touch. She kept collecting data, not for publication, but for an archive she maintained in a series of bright violet hard drives, meticulously labeled. Reed, Aris's mentor, told me that Aris never stopped believing the full truth would one day be acknowledged. But it wasn't an optimistic belief, it was a grim, weary conviction. She kept researching, mistaking thoroughness for action, because what else was there to do? The research itself was already complete, the anomaly was undeniable. But the system was designed to acknowledge only what it could already explain. No, I still don't know if I made the right choice, talking about this. Maybe you felt this too, that specific exhaustion of being right about something no one with power will act on. I'm not going to pretend this resolved cleanly. It didn't. What Aris found, what Elara Vance had known for 60 years, just kept existing, in that quiet hollow, slowly expanding, watched over by a woman who could measure it, but not change how the world perceived it. The last time Reed spoke to Aris, she was talking about the intricate root systems of the specific violet mosses that thrive near the loop, how they seemed to hold the soil in a different way, almost as if they were trying to anchor something that was trying to float away. It was a detail so specific, so perfectly observed, it hurt. The specific exhaustion of being right about something no one with power will act on, that's the residue. It's not sadness, not anger, not even resignation, not exactly. It's a kind of deep, fundamental weariness, like carrying a stone in your pocket for years, knowing exactly what it is, its weight, its texture, its impossible origin, while everyone around you insists it's just air. And you can show it to them, let them hold it, let them measure it, and they will still tell you it's air. And after a while, you stop arguing. You just carry the stone. Aris chose to quietly document her truth and mitigate the anomaly's effects, rather than publicly fight an institution that refused to see. If you were in her shoes, with irrefutable data, would you have done the same, or kept pushing for recognition? If that specific exhaustion of knowing a truth no one in power will act on resonates with you, or you're drawn to the quiet anomalies lurking just beyond our sight, then you found your community. We're here to explore those truths that others refuse to acknowledge. If Aris's quiet, persistent struggle against an unseeing world, or that heavy feeling of carrying an unacknowledged truth, reminds you of someone, please share this with them. Sometimes, just knowing another soul understands that specific exhaustion can make all the difference. Faced with a truth like Aris's, one no one would acknowledge, would you keep carrying that stone, or eventually let it go? I really want to know your thoughts below. If Aris's grim conviction, and the deep weariness of carrying an undeniable truth, resonated with you, the like button is right there. If you're someone who understands the quiet persistence of Aris, or the deep weight of an unacknowledged truth, this channel is for you.